Hello again, bird nerds. It is I, Grant Williams, the bird nerd, or a bird nerd. I don't think it's fair if I can take the glorious mantle of the bird nerd. It's the bird emergency again. Today we're going to talk more about penguins. Why? Because penguins rock. I will hear no words against penguins. And I'm joined by Penguin Dude, Javed Riaz. Hi, Javed. Now, did I get Riaz right, or is it Riaz?
It's Riaz, but I don't mind exotic pronunciations, however you want to, however you want to call it.
Is there anything exotic about any Australian pronunciations of any words? I don't think.
Perhaps not, no, but
I
I
don't
often
think.
get I often get mistaken for being Spanish, so people often roll their R's. They say Javed Riaz, which is always welcome. Bit of diversity.
Mate, let's get really, really, really controversial. Being a a darker hued Australian, how many people come up to you in the street and go, can you understand me?"
Fortunately, that hasn't happened all too often, which is good. Yeah.
Oh, well, that is good. I might get rid of that slightly racially oversensitive introduction. But hey, come on, let's be real about Australia. A lot of us is good. A lot of us is a bit questionable. Javid, tell us about where you're studying. I hate saying studying, but you are a PhD candidate, so you're still studying.
Mhm.
Tell us about where you're based down in Hobart.
Yeah, so I'm based in Hobart at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. So that's connected to the University of Tasmania. It's the Antarctic Institute down here, the university-based Antarctic Institute. I'm also affiliated with the Australian Antarctic Division, which I'm sure a lot more people will be familiar with. It's the Federal Antarctic Agency. Australia's operations down in Antarctica comes from the Antarctic Division.
Now, that begs the question: how many times have you been to Antarctica?
Well, you're not going to like this answer. I actually haven't been down there yet. The past 2 years have been attempts to try and get me down, but just COVID and other logistical issues hasn't happened yet. My fingers are tightly crossed for the field season this year. But yeah, so far I've been studying the Adelies remotely, which has been interesting. But yeah.
Okay, well, that leads to a question about methodology. But first, I want to ask, if you haven't been able to get down there for 2 years, how disappointing has that been? And what kind of training do you have to do to be let loose in the Antarctic?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's slightly disappointing. Having said that, there is plenty of data for me to play with, and we've got over 30 years of this Adelie Penguin data. So for me, from a PhD and from a research perspective, I am basically in a playground of data. So there's plenty to do, plenty to keep me busy. Now, to get down there, I have been doing other kinds of work with seabirds. I've been to Wedge Island, which is just off the coast of Tasmania, helping other researchers deploy GPS devices and other kinds of biologging instruments on the shearwaters that nest there. And then it's just a matter of, putting your hat in the ring and seeing if you can kind of get lucky with your field works down south.
On Wedge Island, are they wedge-tailed shearwaters that you were working
Short-tailed
with?
shearwaters.
Short tails,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And uh, I was interested in the selection process. Before we talk about the Adelies, how do you get selected to actually go on an expedition to Antarctica? Is it mostly about your project, about the science that you are wanting to do, or are they also assessing what kind of a fantastic physical and emotionally mature individual that you are.
So I'm quite fortunate because I'm in the seabird ecology group at the Antarctic Division. So I guess I have a foot in the door already. I'm aware of the research going down. My research is directly relevant to the field work down there, so it's beneficial for me. But yes, in terms of the selection process, it is quite a rigorous process. So you have to be able to justify why you should be going down there in terms of your research. You have to have the skills to go down there. You have to have seabird experience. And you also are subject to quite an intensive medical and psychological assessment as well. And obviously going down there, going down south, you're there for most of the summer. So you might be there for a 3 or 4 month period. So if you're not in a medical condition or a psychological condition to be in one of the most remote and harsh ecosystems on the planet, probably not the best idea to be going down for such a long period of time.
Look, don't identify anybody, okay? But
Yeah.
do you know anyone who has applied and then has been found to be not psychologically fit to go?
I have been. I don't know anyone personally. No, I know plenty of expeditioners. Plenty of my friends have gone down. People in my circle, so they tell me that what the medicals and psych assessments are all about. But no, I don't know anyone personally that has been booted for those reasons.
Wouldn't that be? That would just be devastating. I reckon I'd strike out on one. I don't know that they're sending people down there to make podcasts. So ding ding ding. Number one, physically, I'm not sure I'm an outstanding outstanding specimen who could undertake the rigors of an Antarctic summer, let alone an Antarctic winter. And three, I don't know how do you get assessed to be emotionally okay to go and hang out with people in like those tubes and get snowed in?
Yeah, well, the Antarctic Division have their own medical and psychological experts doing that, and they're very experienced. They've done this for decades, so I think they know what it takes to be an Antarctic expeditioner.
So you've already passed, haven't you? I'm not being a harbinger of doom for you, I hope, just by bringing it up.
Touch wood, yeah, no, it's I will need to, if the opportunity does arise this year, fingers crossed, I will need to go through those medicals and psychs just like everybody else.
So they take a team of about 30 down there, don't they, each time? And there's like 10,000 or something apply.
Yeah, so it's I guess it really depends on why you're going down there. So I know specifically with the seabird ecology team, people that are working with the Adelies and some of the flying seabirds down there, the team can be quite small. It can be less than 5 people. And you really need to, thankfully, the leaders of the lab do a fantastic job in assessing where the priority areas are and just working with the logistics team. So some of the monitoring activities, they go all across East Antarctica. So that's an area that's about 80% of the size of Australia. And it's a coastline that's about 5,000 kilometers. So that's, to put that in perspective, that's basically the distance from the east coast of Australia to the west coast of Australia. So it's a massive area to try and monitor. So there does need to be some selectivity year to year in where you go.
Yeah, I think it's about 40% or 42% of the total coastline of Australia, I think. So
yeah, it's huge.
It's pretty big.
Yeah.
How did you pick Adelie penguins to be the subject of your PhD?
So I did my undergraduate studies in Queensland. I spent about a year of that in Iceland, studying Arctic foxes and doing some of my studies there. And I came back to Queensland, and that experience in Iceland just got me fixated on high latitude environments. And I moved to Tasmania to do my postgraduate studies. I did my honours here, and I spent a long time during my honours dissecting Antarctic fish and seeing what they had been eating. So I was broadly interested in foraging ecology, predator-prey interactions, and things like that. So that cemented me in a lab down here. And once I had finished my honors, I was fortunate enough, one of my supervisors had contacts at the Antarctic Division and introduced me to Louise Emerson, who is the leader of the seabird ecology team there. And she informed me of this really rich Adelie Penguin data set, and that some of my skills that I developed during my honors might come in handy for that kind of work. So, yeah.
So dissecting fish, are you going to tell us a really sad story about plastics in these extreme latitudes?
I fortunately am not going to tell you a sad story about plastics. I wasn't assessing plastics, and fortunately didn't find any evidence in my samples of ingestion of plastics. I can tell you some really cool stories about how these tiny, tiny fish that are less than 20 centimeters, sometimes, I was just dissecting a fish that was about 10 centimeters, and you cut open its stomach, and there's a krill, an Antarctic krill in there, which is pretty much bigger than that fish, just in its stomach. And it's pretty puzzling how they can ingest a prey item which is about the size of them. So sometimes it was very striking and alarming to see.
Are these the kind of fish that have those amazing sort of prehensile jaws that open up super wide?
Yeah, they've got those extended gapes that
the hinge jaws,
yeah, which is quite impressive. Yeah, so, and it explains why they can ingest prey items which are often bigger than them or equivalent size to them. But yeah, it's quite impressive.
It seems like a logical progression to go from Adelie Penguin dinner to studying Adelie penguins. So,
exactly.
Did you have to do much to go from being, let's call a fish head to a bird net?
I mean, the study areas in terms of foraging ecology, that they're within the same area, but yeah, there is a big body of literature to familiarize yourself with going from fish to seabirds. So yeah, you need to learn things about the bird's physiology, about how they forage. It's quite different, even though it's broadly related in the same research area.
Yeah, it's broadly related. They're both in cold water.
Pretty much, yeah.
And neither fly. Yeah, other than that. So, Adelie penguins, did you have a sort of a choice between what seabirds you would study given the data sets, or were you guided by what was available to select the Adelie?
So the Adelie penguin, there's been an Adelie penguin monitoring program at the Antarctic Division for 30 years. So there's data on other flying seabirds there. So different kinds of petrels and things like that, and skuas. But the Adelie penguin dataset is by far the richest dataset. So there's been a big push to understand various aspects of Adelie penguin foraging behavior and habitat use, not just at the Antarctic Division, but in Antarctic research institutes all around the world. And that's because they are an indicator species. So the International Agency tasked with Sustainable Fisheries Management in Antarctica, CAMLA, has listed the Adelie penguin as a key study species in Antarctic ecosystem monitoring efforts. So because of that, there's been a really big push around the world to understand various aspects of Adelie penguin ecology. And my research very much falls into that.
So let's talk a bit about what the data that is available to you is, and how is it collected. That's a pretty broad question. Have a go at that one.
Yeah, so I mentioned that there's a long-term monitoring program happening in East Antarctica. So that we're looking at things like where the Adelie penguins are going, what they're eating, things about their breeding success, their population trends. So it's really, really broad. My specific PhD research is all to do with Adelie penguin movements. So That's basically data that comes from field teams going south and putting tracking devices on these penguins. So I'm talking GPS devices, dive logger devices, so things that we can quantify their habitat use and their movements and things like that. So yeah, my research very much comes with that. I'm particularly working at the moment with about 10 years worth of data. So I've got over 70 penguins in my data set, all relaying information about where they're going and how they're diving in those areas. So having said that, there is also a massive body of data that sits outside my particular data set. So I've also been able to play with the years after 2004. So looking at GPS movements, looking at really fine scale things. And that's basically been going since 1990. So pretty much picture a data set of Adelie Penguin movement running from 1990 to effectively 2019 before COVID.
I'm really interested in the methodology when it comes to putting data loggers, but of whatever type, on a bird like a penguin, and particularly when COVID stopped people going down. So, are the data loggers attached to the same birds, if possible, year after year, or are they different birds? Now, I know you didn't do all the work, but I assume you're familiar with the methodology.
Yeah.
And the other thing that got me thinking is, have there been some birds who, with the replacement crews not going down because of COVID, are there some birds down there that have been carrying the same equipment for a couple of years rather than sort of one season or two seasons?
So to answer your first question, well, I guess I'll answer them both. So the field teams that will go down south, it's a really tough question how you select the birds to put the trackers on. But no, there's no repeat deployments on birds year to year. You go down and it's relatively opportunistic. You see what beds are there, what condition
whoever
they're
you
in.
get gets the you win the prize, Mr. Penguin.
Pretty much. Yeah. And there's also a lot of ethical considerations that go into this. You know, the bird has to be of a certain weight, of a certain fitness, and things like that. So it's relatively opportunistic. And you also, in an ideal world, you want to get an even spread with males and females, or age is also a consideration as well. So there's a lot of things to consider. Now, you might be going down there and you might have, let's say, up to 20 GPS devices that you want to deploy on those birds. So you'll basically attach them to with a bit of tape. You'll attach the devices onto their back, and you'll make it as streamlined as possible and things like that. Now, a lot of the birds, fortunately, also have dive loggers, which are attached to them as well. Now, for ethical reasons, the combined weight of the devices is not allowed to be more than 3% of the penguin's total
overall body weight.
Yeah. So you'll deploy those devices, and because they're central place foragers and they will reliably come back to their nests, you will maybe mark the nest so you'll know which one, where to go. And then during the breeding period, they're only foraging for a few days. It might be between, basically 1 day or a week. So you can come back and you can see when the bird is home, and then you can retrieve that GPS device or that other biologger or whatever it is. So yes, COVID did put a pause on Antarctic field work, but every single year, after every field season, those devices are retrieved. So there's no birds that have been going around for days with this device, for years, I should say, with this device attached on them. And for whatever reason, if we can't retrieve the device, if the penguins, I guess, spent a longer time foraging out at sea than we expected, or it's gone a bit AWOL, then those devices will just fall off reliably around March when the penguins molt.
Okay. So from what you just told me, I heard that in general, the devices are retrieved every couple of days during the breeding season, so that you are not, and that you're not continually putting the device back on the same penguin. Did I hear that right?
Yes, you did. Yeah. So we're recording their short foraging trips. So remove between a few days up to a week or 2 weeks.
Yeah. Whenever you get the opportunity to get back to that particular part of the colony.
Yeah.
Is it one colony that you have been that this data has continually studied? Is it the same population group?
Yeah, so for my research, I'm looking at Javed Island, and it's a really small colony. There's about 2,000 breeding pairs there, just located off the Mawson coast within the Australian Antarctic Territory. Having said that, I guess that's the richest data set, but there is plenty of work that goes on at other Adelie penguin colonies all around East Antarctica. So Hop Island, places outside Casey, other places outside Davis. But definitely Javed Island is the richest monitoring site. And with 30 years of data there, it's actually quite unique to be able to potentially assess changes in foraging distribution and behaviors over that long time period.
So let's just talk a little bit about Adelie penguins before we go back into the weeds about the methodology and what you've discovered. What are the sort of individual characteristics about Adelies that make them really good research subjects?
So the most obvious aspect of that is that they're central place foragers. So the breeding cycle of an Adelies is that all the adults will return to their colonies around October or November every single year. They'll find a mate, they'll breed, they'll have 2 chicks, they'll raise those chicks, and then during the different phases of the breeding season, they'll leave for a couple of days and then come back reliably to feed their chicks before all the adults will depart the colony again around March every year. And Adelies are also a species which they primarily eat krill, which we know are the whole fuel of the Antarctic ecosystem. And they're also a species which are really highly dependent on the sea ice environment. So too much sea ice, and they don't perform very well. They waste a lot of energy commuting over the ice. They have a hard time foraging. And at the same time, too little sea ice, and we know that they also have a hard time foraging, and it doesn't work well for their breeding success. So because of those 2 ecological sensitivities, krill and ice, they're basically an indicator species. So we know that changes in their reproductive success or changes in their population abundance can tell us more broadly what's happening in the ecosystem. It can tell us about the overall health, structure, and functioning of the ecosystem. So they're really reliable indicator species. So that's why there's been a big push to try and understand them a lot more.
Now, is your research trying to analyse the nexus between Adelie success and the sea ice and the relationship with the extent of the sea ice and the population of krill? Like, are they all linked?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that Adelies obviously are really dependent on the sea ice, and but it's very, very difficult to understand the dynamics of that system. So too little sea ice, presumably krill are also, they congregate under some of that ice. So too little sea ice, and it perhaps interferes with the food web, and Adelies are no longer able to catch, large amounts of krill to feed their chicks. But too much sea ice as well, and you can't actually dive in the water to catch krill. It makes it really difficult to find openings. So a lot of research is going into understanding those dynamics, how Adelies interact with the sea ice and how the sea ice actually impacts lower trophic levels.
Adelies breed in the summer season in Antarctica.
Yeah.
When do krill breed?
That's an amazing question. I'm not a krill biologist. I wish I could answer that. Adelies will breed, though, on the ice-free areas of the Antarctic coastline. So that's about 1% of the Antarctic continent. So it's quite a small area, but they're incredibly abundant in those areas.
So can I just stop you there, because I need to be the master of the obvious here so that we
Yep.
don't miss that point. So the Adelies will breed generally on rocky beaches that have. I'm sure we've all seen the documentaries. They need pebbles or
Mhm.
rocks, the little stones to make their nests, and they do their gifts with their courtship behaviour and all that. So
Yep.
so those beaches or those little outcrops and headlands that they use are ice-free zones.
Mhm.
So, so how? Try to explain to us how the sea ice, is important for the Adelies in the breeding season when their actual breeding area around their nest, their backyard, needs to be free of ice. What how do they what do they need the ice for?
So often, when they're breeding on these areas of land, at least during the early stages of the breeding period, there'll be extensive, what we call fast ice. And that is essentially ice that's connected to the land. So, in order to access their foraging grounds, they'll actually, which is the ocean, they'll actually need to cross this ice barrier to access that water. So, they're very much dependent, or they're very much influenced by what the ice is doing. And that fast ice will essentially act as an extension of the land. Now, once
So
they
can
cross this,
so the sorry to interrupt, but again, I've got to put it in non-sciencey terms.
go, yeah,
So basically, they've got to use the ice as a bit of a road
yeah,
uh, to get out further away from the coast, which is where they feed. But if there's if if you if the weather has paved too much roadway, it means that they actually don't have anywhere to build a house. Yeah.
Not that they don't have anywhere to build a house. It's more just about their capacity to forage.
Okay.
So
So
it,
it's a matter of distance.
it's a
So
matter of distance for sure.
okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
um, because I just wanted to be clear about you said they need the beaches or the headlands or wherever they are nesting need to be free of ice, but
Yeah.
they but but they need to be close enough within hopping distance of some attached ice to get out to the breeding grounds. And if that ice isn't there, they actually they can't breed because they can't get to the feeding grounds.
So they'll be on these beaches as you mentioned, and then they commute to the ocean to start foraging. But the problem is, at least during the early part of the breeding season, they can't. A lot of that initial ice, the first 60 kilometers, might be first 20 kilometers of ocean, is frozen. So that poses a challenge for them because they need to cross that frozen component of ocean in order to be able to forage. Now, as the season progresses, that large area of initially frozen ice will break up. So as soon as that,
Okay.
they can basically start foraging as soon as they enter the water from their colonies.
Okay, so because I obviously haven't been there, so the kind of the natural state for most of the year is that all this land is locked in by ice, and it's not until the temperature rises enough and it thins down, and then the ocean movement breaks it up, and you get some of those ice flows and whatnot. So it's a really careful balance between having enough ice or having no ice.
Mhm.
But but can but the having no ice would affects their food source rather than their ability to get around. Am I getting it right now?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
So, yeah, like you mentioned, they having too much ice, yeah, poses a problem for them where they go and forage. Areas where they often nest are they can be permanently ice free, so they won't thaw over and get covered with ice during the winter. It's more just during the summer what the sea ice is doing.
Yeah. And the so the sea ice can be a deterrent in terms of acting as a physical boundary that they can't get to their feed grounds, but they
Exactly.
need to have some ice because it. And hopefully you can tell me I'm right here that their food depends on there being enough sea ice for it to be abundant enough for the Adelies to have success. Is
That's
that
exactly
right?
right.
Okay, good.
That's exactly right. There is also another aspect to it where, if we don't actually know this, but we often assume that when they're out at sea foraging, having a little bit of ice there for them to rest on might also be beneficial because
Yeah.
if there's no ice, then they'll get exhausted. Maybe it'll reduce the length of their foraging trips.
Well, thanks for bringing that up because that was going to be kind of my next question about uh, what do Adelies do day to day? We know that in the breeding season they have to forage, but they have to come back to feed to change shifts with their mate, or to be feeding the chicks, one or two chicks. But what do they do when breeding season isn't happening? Where do they go, and what do they do? Are you collecting data, or has data been collected for the non-breeding season?
Yeah, and it's an amazing question. So around March, when they will leave the colony, we know from some tracking efforts that we have done, I guess outside of that breeding season, that they can range up to 3,000 kilometers away from the colony. Now they'll essentially be foraging in the still around the Antarctic continent and areas where there's components of open ocean, there's components of broken up ice, so they can still have that fine balance between foraging. But yeah, they're very much they'll basically forage all around that pack ice zone in the non-breeding season, and there are tracking efforts that happen outside that. But obviously, being over a stretch of 8 or so months, it can get very, very difficult to track them. In terms of device battery life and things like that. So most of the tracking efforts are concentrated in the summer season when we're not as limited by those technological constraints.
Now, obviously, you've just told us about the difficulties of collecting data in the non-breeding season, but what do you know from the data that has been collected about the birds from this survey site? Where do they generally go? Like, are they heading for sort of the New Zealand sub-Antarctic zone? Are they heading more to Africa? Are they heading more to South America? I assume they need to have some relationship to a landmass for most of the year, be they islands, sub-Antarctic islands or whatnot, just because I assume that their food moves around to other sort of geographical features. So where do they go? Where do they go?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be honest, we don't actually know all too much about where they go during the non-breeding season. Our sample size is limited to basically just a couple of individuals. We know that they will basically forage on the outer ice margins of the winter Antarctic ice extent. We don't actually know if they're going and targeting specific areas year on year. That might be associated with sub-Antarctic islands and things like that. So definitely questions that we'd love to answer in the future. There was a study in 2003 or so that tracked the winter movements of first-year fledglings. And they went west of the colony and still foraged in really close association with the Antarctic ice. But yeah, definitely, I would love to do a tracking study of the non-breeding period to see if there's any reliable sites that they're going to year in, year out.
When does an Adelie penguin get the urge to start breeding? How old are they when they reach sexual maturity?
So they'll start breeding at around 3 to 5 years old. So they'll come back to their colony and they'll find a mate. What they're doing during the non-breeding season, what non-breeders are doing during the breeding season, is still something that is puzzling, because we do know that non-breeders will still come back to the colony and almost forage in a very similar manner as if they had chicks. So it's very, very puzzling. Perhaps some innate behavior there going on.
Do you have any idea of what the percentage of non-breeders is within a colony?
No, I don't have an understanding of the percentage of non-breeders. No, I'm not. I think that's yeah, I think that can be very difficult data to obtain.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I reckon all the data sounds like it's pretty difficult to obtain. Uh, how old? Uh, well, let's put it a different way. How old? What age do Adelies generally get to, and do they have a an age with your understanding of them where they are old, where they might not be dying, but that they are no longer actively engaged in breeding?
So Adelies can live up to around 20 years or so. When we put devices on the birds, we don't know how old the birds are. It's something that's very difficult to obviously quantify. There is some work that I'm familiar with that's happening elsewhere in Antarctica where they have been essentially keeping track of those birds that they've been deploying devices on year in, year out. So, and they know the age of the birds. So that there has been a bit of research to say, okay, how does age affect foraging efficiency and things like that? But certainly nothing with the Australian Antarctic program yet to do with age-related behaviours.
Now, I know you told me before we started talking that you had listened to the Tuaki episode with Ursula.
Yeah, that's right.
And that Ursula told me that the size of the beak is an indicator of age for the Tuaki. But unless you know, unless you have a baseline, it's very hard, I guess, to tell. You can tell that the bird is older, but you might not know exactly how old older is. Is there a way when you are looking at a group of adelies to be able to tell if one is, for instance, 2 years old as against 5 or 7?
Mm. Yeah, it's a really good question. I did listen to that your segment with Ursula, and by the way, I saw her presenting at the World Seabird Conference. I believe it was last year, and that's how I found out about the Tawaki. She did an excellent presentation there. I'm not familiar with a way that you could do that with the Adelies, but I'm positive that veterans of Antarctic fieldwork and Adelie fieldwork would have a much better understanding of that than myself. So yeah, perhaps there's something comparable. I'm not familiar with it though.
I wonder if anyone who's watching at the moment is a veteran of Antarctic fieldwork and can give us a pointer. I think it's they when you see obviously vision on TV of a colony of adelies, I can't imagine that by sight you would be able to reliably pick out individuals, but they certainly seem to have different personalities that once you are familiar with the groups, that you could then pick out the individuals by what they do rather than how they look. Are you, in your data set, which you are accessing remotely, are you following individuals? Do you know individual penguins by code or by some other identifier?
Yeah, so we have a unique identifier for each penguin, and that will just largely be derived from the unique numbers that the GPS devices have on them. So we're able to see the differences in individual behavior, certainly, and it's massively variable. Some birds are doing completely opposite things to other birds.
That was where I wanted to go. I mean, are there total mavericks? Are there and are there conformists within your group as well?
They all seem to be doing their own thing, which is, I have no idea what the driver of that is. Perhaps, maybe they've foraged somewhere in previous years and have been lucky. Maybe they're just going with whatever the marine environment throws up at them.
But That's really interesting. So, to again use my completely scientific expressions here, that they don't sort of follow a behavioural bell curve when you look at their data. If they're all sort of doing their own thing, that means you don't have that middle segment that's 75 to 80% that are kind of doing the same thing over the period that you follow them.
Well, those are questions that we're really trying to begin answering. Presumably there's reliable foraging habitat. So, for example, the shelf, the continental shelf, that's maybe 100 kilometers away from the colony. We suspect that maybe that's where they're concentrating a lot of their foraging activity, because that might be a prey hotspot. But there's so much variability with each bird. It's really hard to say to clearly say, yes, this is a reliable foraging habitat for them year in, year out. So, part of this research is really going into studying the variability that comes with Adelie penguins. And obviously Adelies, they're foraging in a really unpredictable and variable environment. So, that also would play a really big role in their behaviors. They would just have to adapt their behaviors every year to whatever the ice or to whatever the prey field are doing.
Well, let's talk about their prey. How varied is an Adelie diet? Does it vary over the year? And give us an idea of what they eat and sort of what percentage each kind of prey makes up of their diet.
Yeah, so Antarctic krill would make up the main source of their diet. It might comprise about 80% of their diet. But having said that, they are also really, really flexible in their diets. They can eat other kinds of Antarctic fish. They can eat different crustaceans. They can eat different amphipods. And recent studies have come out saying that they can also eat jellyfish in times when, krill aren't doing so well. So they're incredibly adaptable in their diets. Now, krill make up the primary component of their diets, but that's presumably just because they're so abundant in the ecosystem when krill are trying to forage. When Adelies are trying to forage, I should say.
You sort of mentioned before that the colony and where they choose to hang out for their breeding season is quite reliable. I assume that they have predator species like giant petrel and skewers there at the same time, but will they have associations with other beach nesting birds? I think probably only penguins, or do they want to be in their own space?
So when you say associations with other beach nesting birds, what do you mean?
Will they share that area with other penguins? Other penguins nesting alongside or in amongst that colony?
Mm-hmm. So at Javed Island, where I'm working at in East Antarctica, it's you have this massive area that's full of Adelies, but on that island as well, you'll also have a lot of other flying seabirds. So you'll have storm petrels, you'll have skewers that are also nesting nearby. So yeah, they're definitely in amongst a whole lot of different kinds of birds there.
But penguins?
No, not in this particular area. It's all penguin dominated. In some areas, there might be other emperor penguin colonies close by, but certainly, yeah, no, not in this area of Antarctica. It's all all Adelie based.
Okay. Now I might be extending your field of expertise a bit here, but I'm wondering where Adelies fit in the sort of trophic levels, I guess, when we're looking at the food pyramid and occupying real estate. Do they compete directly with other penguins, or are they all selecting different prey and that they can all kind of happily coexist, or are they direct competitors?
Yeah, so in areas where the Adelies are nesting close by to other kinds of penguin colonies, or maybe perhaps chinstraps or gentoos,
Yeah.
then they often are overlapping in their foraging grounds. And there is a lot of research to ask those kinds of questions, saying, is there a particular niche? Is there a separation in their habitats, and also what they're eating at those kinds of years? Because presumably, with competition, you have to have some kind of selection in order for both species to thrive. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's a really good question, and that's something that there's a lot of research going into, definitely. And to answer your question before, leopard seals are their primary, predator for the adelies, and skuas will also, cause a menace to the adelies during the breeding season by trying to take chicks.
Okay. Now, look, the question that I had, I don't think you're going to be able to answer it, because I don't think you've actually been hands-on with them. I really want to know, giant petrels stinkier than Adelie penguins in breeding season?
Yeah, you're right. I can't answer that, but give me a year, maybe I might be able to tell you about all the different kinds of scents of Antarctica.
All right. Well, when we do volume 2, and we might have to subtitle it Volume Poo, because Elodie told me that there's some very, very stinky things about working in the subantarctic. So I'd like to know that, because they look so cute, right?
They do look cute, but I do know from information being relayed to me from some of the other field staff that yes, they are cute, but they are also incredibly stinky.
Are they pugnacious? Like, again, from relaying from second-hand stories of people who have been working with them hands-on, can they give you a bit of a nip? Do they? The documentaries always show people walking in amongst the penguins, and they're sort of just looking up and going, "Oh, you again." But I can't imagine that they don't sometimes give people a nip. It must be very annoying having these people walking through day after day going, "Give me your logger,"
Yeah, exactly. No, particularly when you handle them, they can get very, very feisty. But they'll often try and give you nips. But even so, when you're just walking through the colony, I've heard that it's really striking to see how much variation there is in their characters. Some of them can be aggressive, some of them can just not care. So yeah, very, very variable.
Yeah. You must be really, really, really excited about the possibility of getting down there amongst it. I mean, how many years have you been working with the data now?
So I'm about 2.5 years into my PhD. And yeah, I think since I was a child, I've had dreams of going down to Antarctica and working in, one of the most incredible wildernesses on the planet. So I feel like I'm hoping that I'm close to getting down. My fingers are tightly crossed for this year. But I also understand that, I guess organizing an Antarctic field season can be really, really challenging, and the people at the Antarctic Division have their work cut out for them. So, yeah, it's just got to cross my fingers and hope that I get lucky.
So, if everything goes well and in your favour, when will you be getting on that big red? Is it red or is it orange boat and heading south?
No, it's somewhere in between red and orange now, the Noina. But it would leave around the start of November, and the field season would probably go basically until the very start of March. So for the whole basically breeding period that the Adelies are there.
And you're hoping to be on that expedition, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. But yeah, like I said, we'll just have to see what happens. Now, having low expectations is a good way to be for Antarctic field work.
Well, that's right. I mean, we've all got used to disappointment, haven't we, over the last 3 years or so? Look, I can't let the opportunity go past when talking to somebody about Antarctic research and not use the C word, right? Climate change. It's the CC word.
Yeah.
Uh, you've been looking at, a 30-year data set. Um, Now, I'm not asking you to become a climate scientist overnight, but I'm wondering if your analysis of the data that's available to you, is it giving you any sense of um, the effect of a changing climate on the Adelies?
Mm. So part of the mysteries or the challenges with answering those kinds of questions is that the Antarctic field season is the Antarctic ecosystem, I should say, is very, very variable from year to year. So some years you might have very, very little ice. Some years you might have a lot of ice. So really teasing out those kinds of trends can be very, very challenging. In this particular area that I'm working on in Antarctica, sea ice seems to be increasing over time, whereas other areas in the West Antarctic Peninsula, sea ice is dramatically declining. So in the West Antarctic Peninsula, those Adelie penguin colonies, a lot of them aren't doing so well. In our area of Antarctica and East Antarctica, some are stable, some appear to be stable, whereas there might in other areas there's just heaps of variability. Some years they might have a low population abundance or a low breeding success, and then it might shoot back up to having a high breeding success. So with a long-term data set that we've got, certainly we're going to be able to answer those kinds of questions just to say over time, generally, is there a population decline? Is there a population increase? But we need lots of that data to be able to make those inferences.
Yeah, it's apart from the variability of the environment, it's so difficult just because of the methodology and the number of people who are able to go down each year to do the research to get a significant quantity of data from year to year must be hard. So, um, how difficult is it to reach conclusions when you're really only talking about a couple of dozen penguins at best each year that you're studying? Um, does that limit what you are able to say at the conclusion of a project?
Absolutely, yeah, and particularly with some of my research looking at their movement behavior, that's something that I would have loved to try and answer. You know, the interannual, the year to year variability in movements. But some years, we might only have 5 penguins. Other years we might have a bit more. We might have 10. Other years we might have 2. So it's very, very difficult to make conclusions with such a small sample size, particularly because behaviors between individuals can be so variable. So yeah, it's something that's very challenging. But as I mentioned, with a long-term data set, we're able to make broad conclusions about potentially if there's changes in habitats and things like that.
So, with that being the situation, does that mean that you need to change the parameters or the hypotheses that you are testing with your research? Like, how flexible do you need to be about what your project is, if we just put it in a box, year to year based on the available data?
Yeah, it's you need to be very careful in the research questions that you are coming up with. And with my research, I've been looking more at broad scale population trends to see, okay, is there a reliable area that the penguins are going to, or where the penguins are feeding? So yeah, you just need to be careful, and you need to make it clear that yeah, I guess you need to be aware of the limitations of your research, that things might change year to year, and it's going to be very difficult to capture that variability. But yeah, you just got to make use of the data, and hopefully we'll be able to answer those year to year questions a little bit later down the track.
Do you see yourself being a Antarctic researcher long term?
I would hope so. Yeah. So I've had an amazing journey in my PhD. I have worked for the Antarctic Division as well on the Davis Aerodrome project, um, and yeah, it's a place where I very much feel at home. And I'm very passionate about Antarctic ecosystems and Southern Ocean research. And Hobart is certainly a fantastic place to be if you're interested in that area. Having said that, academia can be very competitive. So I am, I guess also at the whim of opportunities and funding, just like everybody else.
Tell us about the Davis Aerodrome project.
So there was a development project that the Antarctic Division put forward to build basically a permanent runway down in the Davis area. So the Davis Aerodrome project was all about doing a very rigorous ecosystem assessment and seeing how, I guess, understanding or quantifying potential impacts under some kind of environmental assessment.
And did is it going ahead? Like, are they building a runway? Have they built the runway? What were you doing? Like, because you mentioned earlier on that some of your other skills were in data analysis. So were you analysing data, or were you out there with a tape measure and a shovel?
So I was assessing Adelie Penguin habitat use, similar to what I'm doing for my PhD, just in a different area to try and understand potential impacts to the seabirds there. But the Antarctic Division last year decided that for, I guess, Antarctic conservation reasons, that it was best not to proceed with that project. So
it was pretty controversial, wasn't it?
It was controversial at the time, but the Antarctic Division did a great job in performing the environmental assessment and coming to a conclusion based on those results.
That's what it's all about, isn't it? It's called science. So,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, really, really, really good. Now, normally about this stage of the conversation, Javed, I would leap into the sort of bird emergency questions, but because you're not a committed bird nerd, some of those questions probably won't make a lot of sense. But let's modify them slightly. You've come from sort of being a fish nerd, or a fish head, as I like to call you guys. Have you jumped the shark? Are you now a bird nerd?
I think I'm a generalist ecology nerd. Ranging from marine mammals to seabirds to fish. So definitely more of a generalist. I was preparing for you to ask me some very bird-specific questions. So I'll just, other than my love for the adelies and other seabirds, I will also confess my love to narwhals. They're probably one of my favorite animals. I know it's not a seabird, but they're awesome.
So you've seen narwhals?
I haven't seen narwhals. No, I spent some time, as I mentioned, up in Iceland, but it's a bit too south for the narwhals. I had hopes to get up to Greenland but then COVID hit. So my partner's mum lived in Greenland for a while, and we were hoping to get up there, and then hopefully I'd be able to fulfill one of my childhood dreams and see narwhals.
Now, I hate this when I go overseas and I say to people, or they'll say where you're from, and you go, oh, I'm from Melbourne, and they'll go, oh, do you know such and such? But Iceland is not Melbourne, so I can't resist it. Did you meet any other bird researchers when you were in Iceland?
Oh yeah, it's a hotspot for bird research, as I'm sure you're
Yes.
aware. It's an amazing place. So yeah, lots of bird activity happening in Iceland.
So that gives me the opportunity to ask, and without it being a stupid question, did you meet Yoav Perlman by any chance?
I did not. No.
Okay. Well, there we go. Sorry for that tedious part of the podcast, people. Yoav is studying Wimbrels, I believe.
Oh yeah.
And we've had a conversation. So, but it's not in the feed yet. So
Yeah,
people
right.
will
This was in
people will
2014, 2015. I don't know if you would have been there then.
I think that's about
Yeah.
the time
Yeah,
he
right.
started
Okay.
journeying. He did say he'd been there. I think enough to learn basic Icelandic.
Yeah,
So
right.
he spent
Okay.
a couple of years there. But anyway, that's
Yeah, I met some people. I don't remember their names now, but during some of my Arctic Fox field work there, I remember seeing some bird nerds who were effectively holding a little microphone and dropping that down the cliff to see if they could record the sounds of the kittiwakes and the guillemots.
okay,
Yeah,
or the orcs or something. Yeah, they're
yeah. It was
fantastic.
pretty impressive to see.
That is good. So you're you're a bit of a seabird nerd now. We'll let you wear that t-shirt.
Honorary title.
Yeah, well, no, you can have the t-shirt. I think you're allowed to. Hashtag seabirds. Uh, have you? But do you go bird watching for pleasure in any of these environments? I mean, I'm not going to ask you about Queensland. I don't think you've probably ever gone looking for the wampu pigeon, have you?
No, I
Uh,
haven't.
but do you go out on pelagic bird watching trips looking for
I haven't done
albatrosses?
it all too often. I sometimes have friends that go out and do that, and I'll head out with them. Um, but yeah, certainly it's yeah, being a bit of a generalist, I'm pretty much interested in everything. I'm not specifically bird crazy. But yeah, lots of cool things, lots of cool seabirds here in Tassie and also up in Iceland. And so going out and doing trips to see if you can find puffins and things like that. That's definitely something that I've done. But yeah,
Have you got any plans to go back to the Arctic rather than the Antarctic to do more study? Or more,
yeah, absolutely.
let's not call it study, more research, because you'll be Doctor Javed by then. So
Yeah, hopefully in a couple months I'll be donning that title. Yeah, absolutely. I think the Arctic's, initially piquing my interest for high latitude environments. Definitely, I would love to go up there. Like to go back to Iceland and continue my research with biologging. So trying to understand movement behaviors, not just of seabirds, but potentially of other kinds of marine animals as well. That's definitely an area of research that I'm very passionate about. So if I can get to the Antarctic or get to the Arctic and to continue that research, I think that's the end goal for me.
now it's been difficult to modify the bird emergency questions for you, not being a bird nerd, but I do think I have the requisite hard hitting question for you that is
Yep,
right up your alley. So are you ready?
go for it.
Which is better, the Arctic fox or the Adelie penguin?
Oh, I don't think you're allowed to ask that question. It's too harsh. Um,
Mate, we cover the hard questions here, so you're
yeah,
on the
look,
spot.
Adelies have a special place in my heart after researching them for so long. And as it was put to me on my first day of my PhD candidature, my task was to become one with the Adelie Penguin. So they definitely have a special place in my heart now. But yeah, having said that, I also can't forget my experiences with the Arctic foxes.
That sounds like UTAS is an extremely zen kind of environment, Jarvid.
This was actually the Antarctic Division who tasked me
Oh,
with this. Even
oh
better, so a
no!
government agency
The
tasking me with this.
the look. Don't let anyone in the government know that the public service is going zen. Oh no! It's terrible, terrible. Now, Jarvid, we're jumping the shark. Now, I just want to give the opportunity to those watching live. If you've got a particular question that you'd like me to put to Jarvid about Adelie penguins or indeed Arctic foxes, I mean, we're not going to discriminate between classes of animals here. We're not classist at all. Just pop that in the comments and I will see that. Uh, Javed, how difficult was it coming from Queensland to Hobart?
Um, It was a bit of a shock to start with, because Hobart is probably one of the less stereotypical Australian cities I've been to. It's very much more similar to New Zealand in a lot of ways. So obviously going from 35-degree summer temperatures to a much more mild climate, that was something that was a little bit of a shock. But I've definitely, it's a very small community, particularly the ecology researchers, or the university and the Antarctic Institution researchers. So very easy to feel at home very quickly.
Did you do your masters at UQ?
No, so I did my honors down here at IMAS as well, and that was looking at Antarctic fish, and then transitioned into a PhD after my honors.
And was your undergrad stuff at UQ?
My undergrad stuff was at Griffith University on the Gold Coast.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, now we haven't had any questions from the peanut gallery, Javed, but I have another Adelie Penguin question.
Yeah.
Do they mate for life?
It's a good question. There has been some evidence to say that some pairs will rematch year to year, but I don't think it's that what is often that myth that they'll mate for life. No, I don't think it's like that.
So they might get together with the same girlfriend and boyfriend each season, but when the parenting duties are done, they go their own separate ways. They're back off to different parties. So.
Yeah, exactly. And perhaps there might be a timing mismatch between when those pairs are there. So back, in which case they'll probably just go with another mate.
Yeah. So I'm going back to almost where we started off, but in that period where they disperse from the breeding season and they do go their separate ways, do we know enough to be able to say if they're hanging out in groups, or are all the fishing expeditions solo, or do they maybe come back to an ice flow and hang out intermittently? I mean, what do we know about their off-season behaviour?
Well, because of those technological and logistical constraints, we don't know a whole lot about their off-season behavior, but certainly during the breeding season, when it's a lot easier to observe them, they do hang out in flocks. There is a lot of social behavior happening, a lot of interaction with each other. And they might all congregate on this one iceberg, and then they'll just wait for one of them to jump in before they'll all start jumping.
And then they'll all go.
Yeah. I would love to research whether there is any group behavior with how they're foraging and things like that. That would be something that's really interesting to understand.
Now, this is good. Someone's followed my lead here. Johanna, do the Adelies know each other? So do they have friends? And that's kind of what I was interested in. Like, do they... It seems hard to think that birds that nest in colonies and are so dedicated to each other for that breeding success, with the feeding each other and swapping over, doing the shifts, it's hard to think that they would then go, all right, see you next year, and that they wouldn't want to be maintaining some kind of social bonds in the non-breeding season. So what's your view on Johanna's question? And I hope it's Johanna or Johanna. I'm going to get it right if I try both of them.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I find it hard to believe that they wouldn't be, some long-term social interactions. So we know that they'll repair with a mate year to year. They can do that. So perhaps I've always wondered as well whether chicks from previous years have gone up to their mum and dad and said, hey, you know me, let's team up during this breeding season. Yeah, it's a very, very good question. But a lot of these penguins, when you go there, they look exactly the same. It's hard to tell them from each other. So it's so hard to know how social they're being and what they're doing, how they're communicating to each other, and whether there is any of that long lasting social interaction.
Yeah, really interesting question, Johanna. I also wonder about. Actually, I will put this to you. Did you have any preconceptions about Adelies and what you might find out based on the kind of wildlife documentaries and the style of how they are presented to us? Because we grow up with all this. We think we know about penguins, right? We think we know about albatross because of what we are seeing in documentaries. Did you have to put some of the stuff that you thought you knew aside based on what you had consumed over your it's your whole childhood, and particularly Adelies,
So one of the things that that I guess that the familiar thing with Adelies for me, and when I first started, my PhD and my research, just watching different kinds of footage and things of them, they're often depicted as really clumsy little seabirds. There's pictures of them slipping over the ice and things like that. So certainly with my research looking at their movement behavior, it's been incredibly remarkable for me to see actually how well adapted and how supreme they are to foraging in their environment. They're incredible predators. They work very, very hard during the breeding season. They're often depicted as clumsy or a bit silly, but I think they are just very, very resilient. And, the fact that they just know their environment so well, even though it's so unpredictable, is something that was really striking to me.
That has just brought another question to mind. And Johanna, if you want to follow up, feel free. Are they cooperative predators? Like when they're fishing, are they cooperative?
Yeah, so there's been a bit of work done on this in the Scotia Sea, I believe. There is some definitely observations that they do forage cooperatively. They forage in little flocks. The story of that underwater is something that I would be really interested in finding out, whether there's any kind of herding behavior or any attempts to aggregate prey together to make it easier to consume. But certainly just from surface observations, definitely they're hanging out together. Sometimes, yeah. So hopefully, presumably, there's some kind of cooperation in underwater hunting tactics as well.
Which kind of begs another question, doesn't it? It seems totally unlikely, would be my thought, that they are not maintaining those social bonds and that cooperation for what I'm referring to as the off season, for that whole time that they leave the colony and they go somewhere else. It just seems to me that they wouldn't employ a cooperative strategy for one time of the year and then not do it at the other time of the year, unless they are completely going after a different kind of prey,
perhaps.
Which I don't
but
really know.
Another way to think about that is, survival is very challenging in this ecosystem. There's sea ice and uncertainty with the prey field. So I think a lot of the penguins will just be doing what they can do to survive. And sometimes in order to maximize their survival, maybe they want to minimize competition. So maybe, going solo might be more favorable for them in terms of survival.
Well, that's why you're the scientist and I just make podcasts, mate. I hadn't even thought about that. I thought that there might be some advantage in continuing that flock relationship. Actually, what do you call a group of Adelies?
Yeah, you'd call them a flock. Yeah, similar to other seabirds, or yeah.
Okay, not the squadron or the waddle, or there's so many. I saw
I
someone
like
calling.
Squadron. I think Squadron could be a good replacement.
Well, I've seen a number of different collective nouns used for penguins. The squadron is one, and a waddle is another one, which
Yeah,
I've seen.
right.
It. I think I've even seen people refer to a pack,
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem right to call it a flock. Uh, I just can't put a flock of starlings or a flock of seagulls in the same sort of headspace as a flock of penguins. They seem more like an unruly mob.
Yeah, and I think they often appear like that, to be honest, as well, rather than some nice coordinated flock.
Yeah. Look, almost last one. Anyone watching still take the opportunity to ask a penguin scientist a penguin question. Um, are there is there a hierarchy within the colony? Like, are there dominant pairs, or is it just once they've staked out their piece of real estate and stolen the pebbles that they want from their neighbours, uh, uh, do the pairs keep to themselves, or is there some kind of cohesion, social cohesion within the colony?
Cohesion between males and females, or cohesion between different pairs.
I'm thinking more that let's tackle each one. I assume that there is a social cohesion between the pairs, but is there some kind of cohesion or systematic dynamics with between pairs within the colony?
Yeah, it's that's a really good question between pairs within the colony. You might have some cases where chicks are abandoned, or the adult might have died out at sea, in which case, yeah, there can be some kind of adoption things happening. I don't know if that's based on social cohesion more than just opportunity to
Yeah.
raise a chick and fulfill those innate behaviors. So yeah, really good question. But certainly between males and females, I will highlight, yes, there's extreme cooperation between those two. They work in tandem incredibly hard to raise their one or their two chicks. And they're alternating provisioning trips and duties to keep the chick warm. It's actually astounding to see their level of cooperation. And, one of the pairs, it might be the female, which is just sitting on the egg during incubation for weeks, starving itself, waiting for the male to come back. And it will just be steadfast. It will just be so resilient and wait until the males come back before it can go off and actually feed to survive, as well as for its chick.
Are there any webcams that are streaming the colony live set up that the public can actually log into, like there are with the albatross cams and peregrine cams, or is the environment just too severe for that to be done?
Yeah, that's an awesome idea. With the Australian Antarctic Division, there's no live streams available to the public, but certainly in some of the monitoring efforts, we have set up cameras where we can see changes in nest structure, or whether the chicks made it over a period of time. But that data is all held internally for now. But yeah, that's a really good idea with the live streams, and hopefully efforts like that can raise a bit more awareness about how awesome these birds are.
Oh, wouldn't it be cool? I mean, I think the technology exists now that could be done. They just need to put a budget towards it for the probably have to be satellite internet feeds or something. So sure, it could be done. That there you go. That's your postdoc project there, Joe. Well, the last question I want to explore your relationship with Pint of Science, because of course we're talking as a result of the Pint of Science Australia, which is wrapping up today. How did you get involved, and have you been chasing up anyone else's Pint of Science activities?
So I was contacted by one of the volunteers of Pint of Science, who was familiar with my penguin research. And obviously, I don't think they knew the specifics of my research, but penguins are very charismatic by nature, and naturally you assume that anyone studying penguins has something interesting to say about them. So I was contacted by one of the organizers, and I agreed to get engaged this year and promote the penguins and the Australian Antarctic program. And that's been really good. I didn't realize the scale of the Pint of Science Festival. So that was something that was incredible and slightly intimidating, but it was a very, very cool experience. And I think it's such a great initiative to get science out of these institutes, out of the labs, and actually communicate it in a way that is palatable to the general public. That was a really good exercise to do, just to take a step back and say, hold on, why is this research important, and why should the general public care about this research?
Dear listener, I hope you have worked out that I'm a perfect fit, because I can dumb anything down. There is no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Javed, you were referring to Michelle, I think, were you, as the volunteer?
No, so I believe I was working with volunteers, and specifically in Hobart. I think Michelle might be coordinating it more on a national level, but I was very much just interacting with the Hobart crowd here.
Now, dear listener, we're not doing complete in-jokes here. You can meet Michelle in a previous episode of the Bird Emergency about bird flu. And Michelle's working out of, I think it's USyd, University of Sydney, I think, and her Twitter handle is Duck Swabber, because she's into ducks. So please do go back and look for our bird flu episode, which I should know the number off the top of my head, but I don't. I think it's in the 20s. So, way back then. It's been great to meet you, Javed, as part of the Pint of Science Australia festival. Is it a festival? Is it an event? I kind of think of Moomba as a festival, but it's a great event, and worldwide. It's really interesting to see France, and it's been going strong in the UK for a long time. But hopefully next year we can find a whole lot more bird scientists to be involved in Pint of Science, and hopefully we could go back to more live events, and maybe we can do volume 2. Will you be finished? You'll have wrapped up and handed in your homework by this time next year, and got your gold star and a cape by then?
Yeah, I certainly expect so. I certainly expect, towards the end of this year or the very start of next year, I will be wrapping up and looking for the next opportunity. Hopefully that's, still here in Hobart, but yeah, who knows where that could take me.
Well, dear listener, I hope you have enjoyed meeting Javed Riaz. I have enjoyed speaking with him. There is almost nothing better than talking penguins. Seabirds are amazing, so get onto Twitter. Javed, your socials, what would you like people to follow up with you?
So my Twitter is Javed Z Riaz, and I think that's the primary outlet. But if you want to see any of the research, you just look me up on Google Scholar, and you can see some of my PhD research outputs.
And of course, let's do the YouTube internet thing. Linked below. Of course, I'll have links on the Bird Emergency website and in the feed for Javed and for the Institute and everything that he's let me see with the project on the Adelie Penguins. Thanks so much. I'll look forward to joining you again on the Bird Emergency, and look, hopefully in a year's time we will be speaking to Dr. Riaz.
Thanks so much, Javed, for having me, Grant. It's been great.
Cheers, mate. Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye-bye.